Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be painting up these two cool Borderlands Psycho models from Monster Fight Club's new Borderlands board game. To get them started, we're using a light base coat, and then we're going to, with a big crusty old brush, just put some Nuln Oil Gloss all over them from Citadel. This will be the base point, kind of the starting point for the comic booky Borderlands style. And to highlight that, we're going to then take a paper towel and actually you're going to dab the wet Nuln Oil Gloss from the raised surfaces of the miniature. It's important to use a lint-free paper towel for this. It's worth going to an auto body shop or something and getting some of those blue lint-free paper towels. That way you're not leaving little flecks of dust and debris from a traditional kitchen paper towel. You could use a cloth too, but I think paper towels work a little bit better. Next up, we're going to get a little texture on the base with some Citadel Agrellan Earth texture paint. The bamboo skewers really work great for applying these paint. The pointed end lets you get in between the feet, and you're going to get that on a nice thick layer. Probably be using these across a lot of the Borderlands miniatures so they have a cohesive look to them. And then while the texture paint is drying, we're going to further kind of add to the comic booky shading on the miniature, trying to go for that Borderlands cel-shaded comic booky effect by grabbing some pure white paint. Your choice of what brand you're using. I really like Monument Hobbies, the Pro-Acryl Bold Titanium White. And by adding a little bit of white onto the raised surfaces of the miniatures, that's going to create a brighter, stronger highlight on the surfaces. So you can see I've done a little bit on this one already, and we're just going to go in and do a little bit more. Look at the muscles on the back here. We're just going to take that pure white, and with that pure white, we're just going to hit the raised surfaces of the muscles again. And we're not hitting everything, just sort of the places where sunlight would hit the model. The goal is to create a coloring book that we're then going to fill in with colors. So you've got some bright white areas with the black lines in between. And this is a terrific surface to then start using Citadel's contrast paints on. We're going to go with the orange here for the Psycho's orange pants. And the black lines that you've created in the first step, just like a coloring book, give you a guide of where to put the colors. You want to be putting the orange within the black lines. We're painting in the lines when it comes to Borderlands stuff. And you can already see a little bit on the kneecap there and on some of the raised edges. Adding that white layer beforehand just brightens up the lightest parts of the model a little bit more than you would otherwise. If you're really trying to speed paint these and get these done fast, you can skip that white stage. Just do the Nuln Oil, dab it off, and then add the color. But I do think that adding the bright white highlight before putting the color on makes the contrast paints pop just a little bit more. You'll see me doing that throughout the Borderlands how-to painting videos. And it's a nice effect, and it's, I think, ultimately a lot faster. Putting the white highlights on first, what you're then doing is having the orange of the contrast paints is helping you blend from the white to the cream color a little bit better. I don't think I said earlier, we're starting from the Pro-Acryl Ivory base coat, but you could also use the Games Workshop's Wraithbone spray, works well too. Quick, just two little V of the same orange contrast that we used on the pants on his mask. And now he's got the signature Borderlands Psycho look. Next up, we're putting some Dark Oath flesh on the skin. Now, you may have heard, if you're a painter, about the contrast paints that you can just kind of glob them on and put them on in one thick coat. But because we have this underlayer of black lines and white highlights, I'm actually aiming to put the contrast paint on in a pretty thin coat. That's one of the reasons I'm using a smaller brush for this, is that it makes it less likely for the contrast paint to kind of glob up and flow over the miniature. The goal is to have just a thin, even layer of the Dark Oath flesh all over the bare skin portions of the miniature. These miniatures from my friends up at Monster Fight Club, they were nice enough to get me up some prototypes to do these painting series, and they are really a pleasure to paint. They're nice detail, characterful models. I love the Borderlands video game. I'm really looking forward to trying out the board game. And the miniatures have all been really fun to paint so far. If you haven't already, I've got videos up about how to paint skags and how to paint claptrap. And these are the first of a series of Borderlands painting videos that I'll be doing over the coming weeks. Another advantage of using the smaller brush is that once you get into some of the detailed portions of the miniature, you don't have to switch brushes. It's no big deal to switch brushes as you're painting. I'll usually have a fat brush and a skinny brush kind of at hand. But it's a little bit faster not to switch. If you're new to painting miniatures, there's a general tip is to try to keep your brush bristles damp. Unless you're specifically using the dry brushing technique, you generally want to have your brush be just a little damp. That thin layer of contrast dries fast enough that it's basically already dry all over the model, just as you've been watching. So what I'm doing here is going in and with the same dark oath flesh, because it's a transparent paint, you can use it to shade itself. So putting more of it on any one area of the miniature will darken it up a little bit. So I'm putting a little bit more in the corners of his neck, on the bottoms of the stomach, any place that should be a little bit darker. And that's one of the things that's really neat about the contrast paints is that they can shade themselves in a second layer. We can't really do that with a traditional opaque paint. If you paint something purple, it's purple. If you put more purple on it, it's still purple. It doesn't get more purple. But with the contrast paints, you can paint a skin, with this dark oath flesh here, let it dry, and then when you want to darken it, you can add more of the same paint on top. So for the female Psycho here, I've lightened up her skin tone a little bit by adding some of the Citadel Contrast Medium to the same Dark Oath flesh tone. That Dark Oath flesh is a really terrific color. It's kind of a ruddy brown. It's not quite as pink as some of the other flesh tones in the range. I think it looks good lightened up with a little bit of contrast medium. If you want darker skin tones, we'll do some of those in a future video. I think that 2 or 3 coats of the Dark Oath flesh works really well for darker skin tones too. Now, in this video, I'm painting 2 miniatures. I'm painting the pair of miniatures and back to back. We'll get both of these done start to finish in about an hour's worth of painting, which you won't see quite all of because we're speeding some of it up and I edited a little bit of it out, some of the repetitive bits. But in about an hour, finished up 2 miniatures from start to finish. If you're painting a lot of miniatures, if you were trying to paint all of the 100 plus miniatures from the Kickstarter all at the same time, you might want to think about using a wet palette, or you might have to be putting out your paint a little bit more frequently. But one of the things that I like about painting 1 to 3 or 4 miniatures at a time is that you can kind of have your colors in front of you the whole time. And as you'll see sometimes in the video, I'll sometimes notice a spot that I missed or want something to be a little bit darker. And then you can go in and you've still got a little bit of the color wet on the palette in front of you. You can grab it and just do a quick touch up. So having done the orange and having done the flesh tones, we're going to go back in here with the Black Templar contrast paint. This is one of the darker contrast paints you can see on the palette down there. It goes on almost black, so I'm going to grab a little bit of the same contrast medium that I was using to lighten up the skin tones on the female Psycho, and use that also to lighten up the Black Templar contrast paint just a little bit. This is one stage of the painting where having a steady hand and a skinny brush can help, or at least having a pointy brush. How small your brush is doesn't matter all that much. What's much more important is how pointy your brush is. If you're using a big fat brush with a thin point, you can paint these little details like the straps and belts and scabbards and stuff here pretty easily. I will say that if you're new or newer to miniature painting, a big fat brush that has a nice tip can sometimes feel a little bit unwieldy because a bigger, fatter brush will hold more paint. I think the bigger the brush you're using, the more likely you are to get more paint on your model than you intended. Because larger brushes have a larger reservoir of paint in the belly of the brush, if you press a little bit too hard or you're still working on your brush control, the larger the brush you're using maybe increases the chances that you slop a little bit of paint somewhere where you don't want it. Which is not the end of the world. These are water-based paints. They're relatively easy to clean up. Worst case, I did this just the other day with another miniature. I held the miniature by the painting handle, turned it upside down, and rinsed the entire thing off in my water jar. And that got rid of the extra paint pretty quickly and easily. All mistakes when painting can be fixed, but is generally easier and faster to paint a little more slowly and make fewer mistakes. So at this point, as you can see here, the miniature is looking pretty good. We're pretty close to the point where we could add the metal and call this miniature about done. I am going to take it another step or two further if you're interested in giving your miniature that extra little pop. But depending on what your goals are for your miniatures, getting it to this stage, add a little metal to the weapon, and that's about half the time that I spent painting the miniature for 80% of the effect. That second half of the video of adding some extra details to the fabric and the cloth, it's not required. I think the white highlights underneath the contrast paints, that gets you a good long ways towards a fun looking miniature without having to spend ages on it. I don't know how often you have to say something before it becomes a slogan, but with miniature painting, stop when you're not having fun anymore. Just base coating your models, just getting some color on all the parts of the models, that might be enough for you, and that's cool. You want to take it a step further? Awesome. You want to take it 10 steps further? If you're still having a good time on step 10, that's cool too. These are your miniatures and your games, and you get to decide what is fun for you to do with them. For me, it's all about the game that's at the end of the tunnel. I love painting, but I'm always painting with a game in mind. I'm always painting to end up with a fun, playable miniature. All right, we're going to time wipe this and finish up the black off camera because you've already seen it on one miniature. And as a next step, we're going to touch up a mistake we made on the hair. I got a little bit of black on the hair where I don't want it. My plan is for the hair to be a nice, bright, contrasting color. So I'm going to take a moment now with a little bit of ivory and white that I have on my palette to just brighten the hair back up again. And then go back in and do another highlight on her undershirt. That's going to stay white, that kind of classic white and orange psycho look. And with the hair lightened up, we are ready to go into the metals. Grab the silver of your choice, a nice brush that you don't mind getting some metallic paint on. I like dry brushing with flat brushes because you can kind of change their shape depending on whether or not you're using the fat side of them or the skinny side of them. And we're just going to get a little bit of silver. We're not exactly dry brushing, but we're also not putting in, you can see on the brush, there's some paint on the brush. This is not quite dry brushing, but we're also not painting it a solid silver. We're painting it such that we're leaving the black that's in the shadows black and getting silver on all the raised portions of it. Kind of a heavy dry brush. And do that on all the metal bits that are on the miniature, which is much of the areas that we painted black earlier. She's got lots of little details and rivets on her gloves and on her belt and on her boots, her knee pads. And because we're aiming for that game at the end of the tunnel, you could go in and paint every grenade a different color. You could put chipped up blue paint on the knee pads. That would look cool. But we're going to make all the metal stuff just silver metal. That's what sounds fun to me today. So for her hair, we got a nice bright Citadel contrast warp lightning. It's a pretty dark green, so we're going to lighten that up with a good bit of contrast medium. It's probably, at this point, 4 parts contrast medium to 1 part green on the brush right here. And that gives a really nice, striking, bright green. And just as an aside, I really want to thank everyone who's watching the video today. We've got this channel started with a handful of videos. We've gotten a really good response on them. And, getting a few hundred views on some of the videos now and over 100 subscribers. That's terrific. If you haven't already, would love for you to subscribe to the channel and keep those new videos coming. And it's been fun to talk with people in the comments and answer questions. So as ever, if you have any questions about the techniques or products that are being used, hit me up in the comments. I'm happy to answer questions down there. So yeah, tons of thanks for all the positive feedback I've gotten, for all the subscriptions so far, and I look forward to making more of these videos. These have been fun to do. All right, she's looking pretty good. We're getting there on these. We're get some metal on the male psycho here. This is very quick. This is 3 times speed, but this is just a minute or two for each miniature to smap a little metal on all the metallic parts. Now, some of you watching are veteran painters. Some of you are new to this. I will say, if you're new to this, metallic paints are something that I would recommend going down to your local game store or hobby shop and picking up some hobby quality metallic paints. You can 100% paint miniatures with craft paints like Folk Art or Apple Barrel from your local arts and crafts store, but the metallic paints from those ranges are really not as good as a high quality metallic paint that you're going to get from Vallejo, from Pro-Acryl, from Army Painter. Any of those metallics are going to be better than the kind of arts and crafts store metallic paints that you might find at a place like Joann or Michael's or something like that. Those crafts paints, they're fine for tons of stuff, but stick with the game store or hobby shop paints for metallics. So sometimes with painting, you have to improvise. You can see I'm mixing paint down on my palette below. I was planning to bring the flesh tones up a little bit with Citadel's Kislev flesh, which is a nice, not too red, kind of light tanned skin tone. But I found when I opened the pot, I had not closed it quite all the way, and it was a solid block of dried out paint. So painting, improvising. Instead, what I did is grab some of the golden brown from the Pro-Acryl range and one of their light flesh tones. That's the pink you can see on the left and the kind of yellowy brown color you can see on the right in the palette. I'm mixing those together with a little bit of white paint to create the sort of bright tan skin tone that I was hoping to use the Kislev flesh for. But that's fine. This is not an exact science. This is mixing stuff together. It's seeing what works. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Miniature would have turned out a little bit differently had I used Kislev flesh for this stage, and I think that would be a good color to use here. But you can always combine some of the paints you've got if you're missing a color that you're looking for. So at this stage, what we're looking to do is add a brighter flat color as a final highlight. We've done that with a lighter orange on the pants, and we're doing that with a lighter skin tone on the skin. And when trying to capture the comic booky, cel-shaded Borderlands art style, putting a flat, opaque highlight layer on top of the contrast shaded base coat really does a good job of that. If you look at the official Borderlands art, it's often sort of a smudgy, shaded figure with bright highlights, and then of course the characteristic black lines. So for the bright orange, what we've done is just mixed a little bit of a nice bright orange paint, added a little bit of white to it, and we're just hitting the upper areas of some of the pants and the orange areas. Now, this is important to note, you're not going in and highlighting every single peak and ridge of the miniature. You're just trying to put a little bit of bright orange on some of the kind of key areas of the miniature. Don't mind my wandering hands here. We'll be back in just a moment. The goal with this is to increase the visual contrast on the miniature. And there's definitely such a thing as over-highlighting. If you go in and you highlight every single ridge of the miniature, every muscle, every fold of fabric, if you highlight everything, what you actually end up with is a flatter looking miniature. So when it comes to highlighting, you often find that actually less is more. I think you're better off applying fewer highlights to smaller areas. On her here, I've really only highlighted her right thigh that's facing forward. Her back leg isn't getting any of this brighter orange, hardly at all. And when the miniature's finished, and you can see in the finished photograph at the end of the video, what that does is create sort of a directionality to the light. It's like the light's hitting her front first and falling off as it goes backwards. At these sizes of these miniatures, that doesn't actually happen, but it does happen on larger objects in real life. So that your forward-facing leg, your forward-facing side of your body is going to be a little bit lighter than the backwards-facing part of your body. And you can create similar effects with the skin and the shirt too. If you kind of pick, when you're starting the miniature, which direction the light is coming from, and then as you're painting, keep that direction in mind and focus your highlighting efforts from that direction. You're applying light with your paintbrush. That's how I like to think of it. And that has the added bonus that it means you're spending less time highlighting. I think painting miniatures this way, I prefer how that looks, and I think it's a little bit faster too. You can see we've done that on her shirt, we've done that on her leading leg, and it's a nice effect. So to gussy up the weapons a little bit, we're going to take some watered down red-brown paint. We're adding a good bit of water. This is probably 5 parts, 6 parts water to 1 part the Pro-Acryl burnt orange there. And you can see how thin it is on the palette. You can see through the paint onto the white of the palette paper. And we're just given a little dot, 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 dab, dab, dab of this watered down paint all over the metal areas. Borderlands psychos are not known for their weapons care and maintenance. So we're going to have basically all the metal on these psychos be a little bit rusty. Some final details here, and take a bit of Citadel Contrast Aethermatic Blue and dab a little bit of that into the eye sockets of their psycho masks. That gives them a nice little blue glow. Now, see, I made a little mistake here, which is no big deal. If you fix it quickly, I wiped it off with my fingers, then dipped my brush in some water, and it's pretty easy to clean up this acrylic paint before it dries. We'll dab a little bit of the same blue into the other psycho's eyes. And the contrast paints work great for lenses and stuff like that. Get that in there. And that little bit of a light blue does a good job, even though this is the tiniest little miniature eyeballs, but they do a good job of contrasting against the orange of his pants. Adding some very small details in opposite and opposing colors can really make a miniature pop and draw the eye when you're looking at the miniature. So the orange and the blue look great together. So for this psycho's, his pants are a little more leaning forward. So if the light is kind of coming from in front and above, we're just going to add those brightest highlights to the top of his butt there, and to the tips of his knees and the top of his thigh. And it does a great job of just giving it that comic booky Borderlands pop. Well, I'm pretty pleased with this miniature. That's it's looking good. We'll add a little bit of the white dot to the middle of the eyes here. The eye lenses on the male psycho's mask are a little bit larger than on the females, so I'm not going to do that on the other psycho. I don't feel like there's really space or need to do that. Having been playing the Borderlands board games since the very first one, these miniatures have really been fun to paint. So to finish off the bases, we're going to give it a generous kind of wash of Agrax Earthshade, which is a brown wash from Citadel. You also, for this, could use a brown wash from one of the Army Painter Quick Shades or something like that. It's just to get in the cracks that have formed on the texture paint and get those darkened. And then we'll let that dry, give the bases a quick dry brush, and the bases will be just about done. I mentioned this earlier, that one of the things I like about working with a palette of colors in front of me and serving the paint up on a palette is that you then can have those colors stay in front of you for future steps. So, right now I'm grabbing some of the white that I served up earlier to give the green hair a bright white highlight to make the green look a little bit brighter. This is the same white that I served up to mix up the flesh skin tones. And when you're just working on a couple miniatures at a time, it's still right there waiting for you. You can take this opportunity to add a little brighter white highlight at the top of her chest. And she's looking just about there too. The Agrax Earthshade is it's a very thin, very transparent brown wash. I just dabbed a little bit of that along her scalp to darken up the transition in between her hair and her skin. So the Steel Legion Drab from Citadel, which is the paint that I just served up here, is an almost exact match for the Agrellan Earth Crackle paint that they produce. And one of the reasons I gravitate towards using the Agrellan Earth as a texture paint, even though you can get a Crackle medium at an arts and crafts store or something that does a good job too, but it's really fast and convenient to be able to use the Crackle paint and then have a matching color to paint along the edges of the bases and finish off the rims of the bases. So to lighten it up, we're going to do a dry brush of the Steel Legion Drab, and grab a little bit of the ivory color. You could use any sort of light bone color or even white. You just want to lighten up that Steel Legion Drab just a little bit, very lightly. Brush your dry brush along the tops of the miniatures. I've wiped most of that light paint. So this is what we'd call a dry brush. And you can kind of poke and dab at it a little bit just to give the earthen base a little bit more texture. We'll clean up the edge of the base later. That sometimes takes 2 coats. But as a final stage here, we're going to go in with a 0.005 micron pen. You could do this with a paintbrush, but I think for on the humans, for the signature Borderlands look, you really want a consistent line width to create that comic booky Borderlands art style. If you look at the official Borderlands art, you'll often see little dots or dashes. In the Borderlands art, those generally aren't placed on the brightest parts of the miniature, but are placed right underneath them to give you just a little hint of shadow and shading. So with the micron pen, you can create those little dots and dashes too as you go. So as you're putting the black lines in between the color areas and in between the major shapes of the miniature, you can go in and just give a little tap, tap, poke, poke with the pen and add some of those little dots. It works well if you place those little dots in 2s and 3s nearby, but not on top of the highlights that you've added in the previous step. You can also go in and use the pen to draw a black line in the deepest cracks and crevices of the model, which can help to accentuate the shading that you got from the contrast paints. I think it can be helpful before this step just to take a look at a couple pieces of Borderlands art until you have a feel for where those black lines lie in the Borderlands art. It's not every single crack and crevice, and I think kind of using them judiciously, putting them some places but not everywhere, is going to give you a better effect that kind of more closely matches the Borderland art style for your miniatures. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, I'm dubious, I don't really want to draw on my miniatures with a pen. That seems weird. That seems hard. These are reasonable things to think. But I really would encourage you to try it. I think for most of us, we have more practice wielding a pen than a brush, and you may find that you really like the effect, especially if you're going for that Borderlands style. And I think that this is faster and easier than using a brush to get the same effect. I'm going to speed it up here. This is probably the single longest step of the miniature, but it's still, I think, quite a bit faster and easier than doing it with a brush. Now, I will say one big warning, one big caveat. Make sure your paint is totally dry before you do it. These tiny little needle fine tips to the micron pens, they work great on fully dry paint. But if your paint is not totally dry, you may end up actually scratching the surface of the paint with the tip of the pen, which is not what you want to do. So just, before you go into the pen, it's a good time to go hit the bathroom, grab something to eat, take a quick break, and come back to your miniatures in 20-30 minutes when the paint is dry enough to not scratch it up with the pen. The acrylic paints do dry pretty fast. You don't have to let these dry overnight necessarily, but you don't want to take a freshly applied coat of paint and then use the pen on top of that. So just make sure your paint is fully dry before you go in with the pen. And hopefully you can kind of see this places on the miniature where I'm choosing to add the black lines, definitely in between any 2 different colors. So in between the hair and the skin, in between the shirt and the pants, but also adding it to some of the creases and valleys of the miniature within each given color. So putting a couple little lines on her shirt, some lines in the creases of her pants. It's a cool effect. I'm really pleased with how these came out. The skags were fun to paint, Claptrap was fun to paint, but these were my favorite. I'm pleased with how they came out. Nothing says Borderlands like a raging psycho with an axe charging at you. These are literally the face of Borderlands. So these were just a blast to paint. It's my favorite figures I've painted so far. I'm looking forward to painting more. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hit that subscribe button, leave any questions or comments you have below. And if you haven't already, definitely check out the Borderlands Kickstarter that's running through Thursday, December 23rd. Thanks again, and we'll see you back here soon with some more Jolly Lark painting videos.